So the second part of our yarn lecture is going to look at novelty yarns. And this looks at a couple more complicated structures. So yarn structure influences the end use, of course, but also the cost of a yarn. Yarns with a very simple structure are identical along their length, but others can be much more complex. Yarns are written as fractions, and so when we say something like a 10-3 yarn, the top number means its size, the size of the yarn, and the second number is the number of plies. So on the left, we'd have a thicker yarn at a 10 denier with 3 plies, and on the right you have a thinner yarn, which you know works indirectly for spun yarns that we see in this example at a 17-2. So a ply, of course, means 2 or more single yarns. The plying yarns increases the yarn strength, the size of it, and it can increase the uniformity of it and the quality. And so this is not untwisting fibers. This is when you untwist, you come out with individual strands of yarns. There's something called a composite yarn, and we looked at composite fabrics. These were layers of fabrics that were completely different from each other that were put together in some way. So you just need to think about it in the same kind of way. Sometimes yarns can be put together to fulfill both staple and filament parts. So they'll have very different structures to them. Covered yarns tend to have a central yarn that's completely covered by another fiber or another yarn. This might be used in surgical or foundational garments. Core spun usually have a sheath of staple around a core of an elastomeric fiber, and it provides a lot of comfort stretch to it. So you'll have one of your elastomers in the middle, but wrap it in something that's much more comfortable against the skin. And so this tends to be a mixture within a yarn itself, but shows up as a blend. And this helps, honestly, in woven fabrics. If you put these type of core spun yarns in a woven fabric, it tends to allow it to act like a knit fabric. It has a lot of elasticity and stretch. Metallic threads can be used in garments, and often a fabric we see this in is lame. It's been used, metallic threads have been used for thousands and thousands of years in garments. What we see now are metals like aluminum that are used in it, or a polyester that's been covered. It's typically a monofilament. It's not that comfortable of a type of garment, but it has a really dramatic aesthetic effect. So some novelty yarns actually influence the name of the fabric itself. And one of these is tweed. Tweed is typically a single spun fancy yarn that has really short fibers that are thrown in while the yarn is being spun. So you can see you have yarns along the length of this in the warp direction. You can see it more predominantly than in the filling direction. But there's just these flecks of color that have been put in. And so those fibers have been put in to add interest to it, and we call it fiber dyed, meaning that before even the yarn stage, while we're twisting the yarn together, fibers have been dyed to add interest to it. Sometimes fiber dyed will mean that, or a tweed may look like a yarn dyed fabric, and that you have 2 different colored yarns put together. Chanel is famous for tweed type of looks. But fiber dyed means that you have different colors of fibers in the yarn and the fabric itself. So as I was referring to, the next kind of stage of dyeing is yarn dyed. So the dye in the yarn actually sets up the pattern of the fabric. So you can see here special care has been taken to dye the fabric different colors so that it may stripe a certain way or that it may look a certain way when put together into a fabric. And so your variegated yarns like this, if you've ever done knitting yourself, you may see a self-striping yarn that does this kind of thing where you have the yarn dyed before it's put into a fabric and creates an effect. Getting into some of our novelty yarns, things that we do different with yarns to create an effect in the fabric. One is called a slub yarn, and this is a thick and thin fancy yarn. When I say novelty, novelty can also substitute for fancy yarns or for complex yarns. Those terms are all analogous to each other. But a slub yarn is one where twist has been varied at regular intervals, and so it creates a fabric like we've seen before, like shantung. Spiral is a yarn that has 2 or more plies that differ in some way from each other. So they can differ in size, which has the kind of the biggest effect, the biggest spiral effect, but they can differ in the twist that they have or the type of yarn they are or the color. But the idea is to really accentuate the twist in the yarn and be able to see a spiral effect from it. Novelty or compact yarns, as we know, have typically 3 parts to them. They have a ground, which holds things together, is the stable core to it, an effect that goes around the ground to add interest, and then a binder that holds the effect to the ground. So when you think about these things, there's just endless variations as to what you could put together. So I want to introduce some of the more common novelty yarns that you may see built into garments. One is called a nub or a knot. And this has a wide variation, but it's an effect where the yarn kind of twists in on itself or wraps around itself in particular places. And so you get this thick and thin look, much like a slub, but it's much more dramatic. Another one is a ratiné. This is also something that you have a ply that loops back on itself, but it's very tight to the core yarn. And so it doesn't have a huge textural effect, but it does create more surface area in the fabrics that it's put on. A spike yarn is like a ratiné, but there's a thicker effect ply. And so it almost has this frosting look across the surface of it, like it's a piece of cake. You'll see this often in more upholstery or bedspread type of fabrics. A boucle can be often confused with a ratiné, but a boucle has much larger loops at regular intervals that come off the surface. And so it has a much larger textural effect on it. It's like a loop pile that's been put on a fabric. Eyelash. So eyelash is where yarn has actually filaments or fibers coming off of the surface of it. So it has loose yarns on the surface that come out and create a much larger pile, so it can imitate a kind of fake fur in that manner. And chenille. We talked about chenille before because it can be created, these yarns can be created by a leno weave. So it has two binder plies, the warp yarns that cross between the pile to hold those short fibers in place and create a very fringed type of yarn. So a 360 fringe kind of the yarn on the yarn. And so chenille is often called a caterpillar yarn. That creates this really soft effect across the surface of it. Some people might call it a pipe cleaner type of effect. And then you might see a ribbon or a tape yarn, which is interesting. So ribbons are actually really narrow fabrics. This can be done with wovens, it can be done with knits, and then you can take those yarns and process them into a fabric themselves. So it can be woven, but also in this case you see a knit structure from a knit tape yarn. And so in this lecture, we are introduced to the idea of plies and what that means as far as the cost and performance of a fabric. I want you to understand the fiber versus yarn dyeing and the different kind of novelty, being able to visually ID the different kind of novelty yarns we looked at in this lecture.